and welcome everyone. Today on Skylines Summer Session we have April Edwards. April is a senior software engineer and Azure advocate at Microsoft. So very warm welcome to you, April. Thanks for taking time out to be part of this. Here today you're going to talk a bit about DevOps and testing, but before we go into all of that, could you sort of tell us a bit about yourself and your job at Microsoft?
Sure. So I'm April Edwards. You can find me on Twitter at the April Edwards or on LinkedIn. Always open to questions and feedback, as such. There was always questions after these kinds of videos about how to maybe take it further, how we did something. So always welcome that. So I am a senior software engineer at Microsoft. I work in the commercial software engineering team. So I'm the build with, code with customers. So I directly work with some of the top customers in the world, deploying their code into their applications and transforming their applications into the cloud, into Azure.
Sounds impressive.
Yeah, nice job. So let's just get started. So what are we trying to achieve with DevOps, April?
So I think, customers all the time hear the phrase DevOps. They want to know, how do we achieve it? What do we do, right? And I think that the first thing we can do is talk about what is DevOps. Let's start with the basic definition. If you go and talk to 30 different people, and even Richard and Gregor, if I speak to you and ask you what is DevOps, I'm going to get a very different answer. So tell me, what do you think DevOps is?
So to me, it's a set of processes, procedures, sort of teams all working together to get one end goal, getting the application out there as quick as possible, as secure as possible, as tested as possible.
Yeah, for me, so when I worked at JP Morgan, there was developer team and there was an ops team, and we kind of didn't work together. So for me, DevOps is kind of these two teams working together to try and achieve a kind of common goal of deploying the code out to servers and making sure everything's done properly. So yeah, I know it's a bit of a basic description of DevOps, but yeah.
And I think if we got 10 more people in the room or 20 more people, everyone would kind of give us a different answer. And a lot of it's based off experience. And here at Microsoft, we actually have a definition we use. And we're very clear on this. And this is a definition we use internally and we bring to our customers. DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to end users. And this is really key. And we want to deliver value. And so, as you both have mentioned, if you're trying to deliver something to your end users as a product or software, what's that value? What are you deriving out of it? And that's really key. We don't want to just deliver code because the code may not have any value. Is that driving value? So we work in, kind of in this cyclical model of DevOps, and you're kind of always continuously evolving your organization as well. And it does involve, the people in your organization and the products and the process in which you use to get there. So those are all really three key things. And I think a lot of customers go, well, it's kind of a theory, I want to know more about it, but we actually have hard statistical facts, and that's really, really important. And there's an organization out there called DORA, and they have actually given us some of these stats to use. When we start achieving as a high-performing DevOps organization, we have faster times that we can deploy, we can do more frequent deployments, faster times to commit our code, and they're showing increased revenue from these organizations and faster time to market. And when I talk to organizations about, this great idea of DevOps, they think, well, how do we get there? What do we do to do it? And, there's so many different ways in which we can achieve that. But I always say to people, look at, Uber and what's happening to us here in the UK with the taxi industry, and even things like Blockbuster. How many of us have, used to go to a video store and rent videos? Now we can order them on demand with Netflix. And that's where these high performing companies have really taken the edge of the market. So I think we really want to look at, where do we start? So today, I think I want to cover off a topic of how we deploy our code, and maybe some great ways we can do this in Azure. So what do you guys think?
Yeah, sounds good to me. Let's do it.
Cool. So we're going to talk about different types of deployment strategies. And this is the one we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to demo in a second, is called a rolling deployment. This is also known as A/B testing. In this rolling deployment, we're going to deploy a new version of our code and give access to a certain percentage of users. And what we're going to do is we're going to pull metrics from that. And when we get metrics from that kind of deployment, we can see how successful this new deployment is, what's the end user feedback, and what's that actual value we've given to these customers or end users. So that's the one we're going to focus on today. But a lot of us may have used a blue-green deployment before. And if you think of this one as like, maybe you have a data center, you have two different environments, and you deploy a new version to your code to the blue environment, and your green's kind of your production, you test that version. And then once it's tested, you maybe ran smoke test against it, unit test, you switch to that blue environment, leaving the green as that kind of that old environment. And then your green environment becomes your new testing environment. So they kind of swap that blue-green scenario. So you test something, run your test against it, and then go to that. Another one that we work a lot with is Canary deployments, and this is really popular for using things like Kubernetes. You might make a change to like 25% of your environment, make a test, and then maybe go to 50, and then 75, etc. So you kind of send that Canary into the cave to test the waters. That's why we call it a Canary deployment. So enough about deployments and DevOps. You guys ready to get into our A/B deployment?
Yeah, let's have a look at it. Yeah, go for it.
Cool. So we have a website. We're going to pretend all of us here watching are part of Tailwind Traders. Now, we're already a very great high-performing DevOps organization. So keep that in mind. So we need to think how we're going to do our testing and what's the best way to leverage it. Now, this website is sitting in Azure. And we've actually been approached by the marketing team. The marketing team says to us, we want to change something on our website. We want to look at this shipping metric here. So if we look at the top of our website, we have this $100 or more for our orders. So that's the threshold. If a customer makes a purchase and they spend at least $100, we give them free shipping. And marketing goes, I want to test what it's like to maybe raise that threshold to $250. So there's a bank holiday weekend coming up. We have a 3-day weekend. And let's pretend for argument's sake, it's Thursday. And we say to them, okay, when do you want this change made? And they're like, oh, we want it by Friday. So in a lot of organizations, we go, right, how do we make this change? Where's our environment? How do we test it? How do we make this real life? And this is where A/B testing is going to come in handy. We can leverage things in the cloud and the tools that we're already using as an organization to achieve this. So the first thing we need to do is, we have access to the code. So we're going to go into Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to open up my editor now. And this is the homepage of our website. So you don't need to know the code. Don't worry about that. But we're going to make a change to it. Now, Visual Studio Code is one of my favorite IDE editors. It has a lot of extensions for Azure, GitHub, etc., and it helps me format my code really well. And even as an infrastructure person, if you're doing any kind of templating or automation, it helps pick up on your code as well and helps correct it. So there's a lot of great features in it.
Yeah, definitely. I use that myself on a daily basis. Being an IT ops is godsend.
It is, and if you've ever written any of your code in like Notepad++ and you miss a space or put in, a semicolon where you shouldn't have, it takes you hours to find it. And this has saved my bacon more than once. So I'm a big fan of VS Code because it really helps me write smarter code. So in this instance, we're going to make a simple change. We're going to change that shipping threshold to $250 here. And if we notice here on the left-hand side, it sees the change. So VS Code sees my change. It's going to upload it to our source control. Now, a lot of people may develop code locally on their machines, etc. That's fine. But because we're a high-performing DevOps organization, both our ops teams and our dev teams have access to the source control. So I've made this change, and I'm going to upload this change. And I'm just going to give it a little message here that we're going to change it. We're going to change our shipping. We're going to commit our code, and we're going to send it off. So I'm going to go back to our website here, and I can go into GitHub and give it a minute, and it will show that it has synced across. It shows that I made this commit about 15 seconds ago. So I could go into all the history of my commit. So any code that I change into this environment for our master website, I can see the changes have been made. I can track those changes. Now, as an ops person and even as a developer team, that's critical to know when changes went into your environment. Because I think, as you both know, sometimes someone makes a change and it brings down the entire environment, and that's really tough, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not. Doesn't make a fun day. So having that tracing capability is really key. So I'm going to go into our pipeline. So what I've actually done is my GitHub here is linked up to Azure DevOps as my continuous integration, continuous deployment tool. So we have a tool, we have a hook in called Azure Pipelines, which is part of the Azure DevOps tooling. And in mine, it's already configured. So it's already configured to set up. So every time I make a code commit to my GitHub, it's gonna go into my pipeline. So we can see that my pipeline's already kicked off here. And if I click on this, that change to my code is going to run. Now, what that change is doing, it's going to package my code, and I'm going to run those tests against my code before it goes to any of my environments. So I'm testing my code from day one. Does that make sense?
Is that unit testing or integration testing, or what kind of testing is that at this point?
So for this piece of code here, I'm doing a bit of a unit test. So I can actually go into this pipeline and see how I've configured it. So I am running a very simple unit test. And at Microsoft, we use a lot of unit testing with our customers off the bat to check the viability of our code, check for any errors once we commit it every time. So if I can go down here, now this is going to be our YAML file. So the YAML file configures our pipeline, and YAML is yet another markup language, basically. We can see that we build our code, and we're testing our code, and we run the test here. Okay, so we're already testing our code. Now we can add in tests. Now maybe in our organization, we have a specific set of tests that we need to run. Maybe we need to run some more integration tests and some more unit tests. We can absolutely add those in here in this pipeline. But I'm just running one simple unit test. So while my unit test is running, I actually want to look at how we're then going to deploy it. So the pipeline is our continuous integration. That's the integration of our code and our testing. Our code doesn't go anywhere until it's been tested. Now, if our pipeline fails, our code fails, and we have to go back and reconfigure our code and address the failure. So if it fails any of the tests or anything else that it might fail, we don't proceed any further. It does not get it deployed into our environment. Okay?
Yep.
So now I want to build out what our release is going to look like. That is our continuous delivery. So I do have a pipeline here. Now in Azure DevOps, we divide our pipelines, our release pipelines into stages. Now I have 3 stages here, and this is really important. So what I showed you before is our production website. And while that's great, I don't want to just deploy into production. I want to deploy into a staging environment. I want to deploy my code into that staging environment and make sure it runs properly. And what I've done in our staging environment here is I've created a job and some tasks. So our website is sitting on an Azure web app, which is platform as a service. So we're not running on infrastructure as a service. We don't have an OS to manage. We're just managing the code. So as an infrastructure person, I don't have to manage the security footprint of a virtual machine. I'm just managing the security footprint kind of prepackaged as a managed service as platform as a service. So there's a lot of benefits to that.
Yep.
So when I click on this task here, I am telling Azure DevOps to deploy my app service to Azure. I tell it what my subscription I'm hooking into is. I tell what type of web app it is. And we have all sorts of web apps in Azure. I could tell it I want to run on Linux. I could do a web app for Linux containers. I could deploy it into an API app or even a function app. So we have lots of options, but for this demo, we're just going to keep it on a Windows type web app. And when we deploy web apps, we have an app service, and I'm going to deploy it to our whole staging environment here. So that's really easy, really simple, set up and ready to go. And I can configure it even further. So I can maybe give this job another name. I can rename it. I can call it, testing Azure App Service if I want to add extra tasks in, but we're just keeping it really simple with the deploy to that app service.
Cool. And is this like super secure? Because obviously Azure DevOps is slightly different to Azure, and I'm guessing somehow they connect up. So is it a nice secure sort of transport mechanism?
Yes. So what devs don't want to talk about is Active Directory and authentication, but we have to talk a little bit about Active Directory. So a lot of the ops teams will be familiar with this. So Active Directory is our authentication mechanism that most organizations use, not all, but it's one of the most popular mechanisms. So I create a service principal, an authentication principal between all these things I'm using. So when I deploy my code to VS Code, it connects into my GitHub, and I've pre-authenticated that with my login. GitHub has authenticated to my pipeline through that marketplace tool. I've pre-authenticated it. And my Azure DevOps is pre-authenticating into my Azure subscription. So I can create that service principal to connect through and allow access from my pipeline to my subscription. What this means is I don't have to actually use an end user to give access to. So I can give my teams access to my pipelines, but not access to maybe my code or the actual environment in which it's running. Does that make sense?
Yeah, nice and secure.
Yeah, it's nice and secure. It's a secure handshake. And then I can use my Active Directory login. So I'm actually logged in with my Microsoft account here. I'll be logged into the portal with my Microsoft account, and I use my Microsoft account in VS Code as well. So if I pull up VS Code, you can see it's authenticated down here. It's my @microsoft.com account. So it's really handy that these all run on kind of that backbone of Active Directory, and then that service principal as that extra layer of protection from our pipeline into Azure, okay? So going back to our pipeline, we have a staging environment. Now, I have actually created a staging environment for our web app. So if I go into our Azure portal, I have a whole staging environment here for this web app. So I've matched a stage in my Azure DevOps pipeline to the actual environment that's running in Azure. And now this could be, in other scenarios, a series of servers or a virtual machine scale set, or it could be a few web apps, maybe with staging slots, et cetera. And we're going to get into that in a second. But I'm running a highly scalable web app, so I don't need a lot of overhead to run this, which is really handy. So I want to go check on my pipeline and see how it's doing. It's still deploying. We can see that it's been running for about 7 minutes. But once that deploys, we're going to see it hopefully pass everything and then start our pipeline. And we can see that our pipeline's getting ready, this release pipeline. And our 3 environments are up here. So if I go back into our pipeline, we know that this is going to deploy into our staging environment. Now, what's really key here is once it's successfully gone through staging, I don't want it to go any further. I want to put in a manual check. Well, this is great that this is automated. I don't necessarily want to go into the next stage. So we have these things called, go ahead, sorry.
Could you show us how it's automated just now? So could you talk us through how you've checked the code in and it's automatically went straight to Azure DevOps and kind of just the continuous integration part?
Yes. So I hooked in my code. And if we click on this here in our pipeline, we can see that it's ran through that YAML file. So it's completed our build job. So I can go into this job and it's run all these tests. So where we saw that YAML file before and it didn't look really clean, we can see it ran through all these tasks here. And it basically gets a tick mark that, yes, you've completed successfully. So if I go into our Visual Studio test, yep, it passed here. There is a small warning here. This won't affect anything in our code. It still passed all the tests that we wanted to. So that hooks into my GitHub piece. So every time I release code, this pipeline is going to run. And what I've done in my release is once it goes through that pipeline and that continuous integration, it creates what's called a package, an artifact. So it creates this artifact that we can take and then insert into our pipeline. So we can have multiple artifacts or we can have multiple pipelines with the same artifact, et cetera. So another instance might be maybe we're deploying to a whole other environment in another location and we could use a separate pipeline, or we could add another staging slot for a different environment. Maybe you're trying to deploy to 2 simultaneous data centers. You could absolutely do that as well. So this artifact is really just our compiled code ready to go. And I've added it as an artifact here. And like I said, we could add a second one. I just add where I want to get my artifact from. So this is the build. This is that CI piece that we just did. You could potentially import an artifact from like an Azure repo or even your GitHub account. And then I ask where it wants to come from. It pulls it in from the build pipeline. And we can see I have another artifact here that I could absolutely use as well. So I could put 2 artifacts into my pipeline and use them in this pipeline. While that goes into there as an artifact, it's not automatic. We have this nice little continuous deployment trigger. So if I were to turn this off, my code would compile. That artifact would be ready to go at the latest build that I specified, but it won't continuously deploy. So I can stop that from going forward.
Okay.
But in this case, sorry, go ahead.
What's the pull request trigger? What's that?
The pull request trigger.
Yeah, just down.
Right there.
Mm-hmm.
So every time I could basically do, if I had branching in my pull requests, I could have a target branch. I could do any kind of build tag. It would allow that artifact to be part of a workflow as well. So that's something you can add in as well. So that one we're going to leave off for now. But I'm going to go into the staging environment. So let's have a quick look because we want this deployed to our staging. And I put in that manual check. So what happens is we click on our release that's happening. We can see that this is deployed to staging and that it's asking me for manual intervention. So where I added that manual intervention, you can add a whole group of, or a team of users. So maybe, Gregor, maybe you and Richard are on the same team. Maybe you need to add a person from another team or a PM to approve it. So once this has gone to our staging environment, I can hit approve. But before I do that, I actually want to go to our staging environment. This is our staging website. Prior to this deployment, it's at £100. I'm sorry, excuse me, $100. So if I refresh my website, I should get the new $250 threshold.
So it can deploy straight to the staging without approval, and then it stops and waits for approval for the next stages, yeah?
Correct. And now we can put in a check before it goes to staging as well. And I'll show you a check I've done for one of my other environments. But yeah, so I want it to deploy to staging. Now, staging is not going to be anything that the public will see. So we know that we've deployed our code. And from here, we can add on additional tests. We could attach things like Azure monitoring and Azure policy after our staging environment and do more thorough checks and start doing some massive testing on our website and seeing how it handles the traffic and how the new code is embraced into that website. So we don't just need to go straight into the next environments. We can add in additional testing. So where I've added this pending approval here, I'm going to go ahead and approve this. While it's running, I can add comments. I can see the logs. I've put a timeout here of 30 days. You can add timeouts of a few hours or a day or various levels as well. So you don't have to. So while we say that it's going to go into continuous integration, continuous delivery, you can add in these manual checks. So I'm going to go into our pipeline and see what else we have configured. So I've configured that as staging environment here. And I'm going to go into our Canary environment. Now, the really cool thing about Azure, and especially Azure web apps, we can use staging slots. Are you guys familiar with staging slots?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, deployment slots.
Yeah, we use it a bit.
Cool. And deployment slots are great for things like A/B testing. So I've actually created a deployment slot in our production environment. So I showed you we had a staging website here. We also have a production website here. So I'm going to click on it. And this is the configuration of the production web app. I'm going to go into the deployment slot, and I've actually pre-created a deployment slot for us, and I've called it a Canary environment. So in Azure DevOps, I've created a Canary stage. So I'm going to match them like for like. So what I want to do actually in this demo is, because we have this deployment slot. Now, a deployment slot is the exact same replica of our production website. It's going to be the same compute power behind that web app. It's going to be the exact same code, and they're really easy to create. And we could create another one here. And when we create them, we have the option to give it a name. I'm going to call this one test. You can choose to clone it from your production website without cloning the settings, or you can clone it from production or the Canary environment. So you'll clone that code and all the settings from those different environments. So this is a really easy way to get multiple copies of your environment without deploying the infrastructure and using the web app, which has that kind of managed service overhead in it. So to really leverage this Canary environment, I want to shift our traffic. So remember when I talked about this rolling deployment, this A/B testing, you don't want to put 100% of your traffic on the new website. You want to split your traffic. So to really give the marketing team a fair assessment of how this change is going to affect our website, I want to split this traffic 50%. So that what will happen is any external user that accesses our website over the weekend will see $100, and the other half will see $250. So I'm going to save that change. So I've basically put a load balancer on the front of my app service plan, which is effectively how they work with these deployment slots. And it will send half of our traffic to one website, half of the other. Now, I've brought in my own, now in theory, I brought in my own custom DNS name, so they won't see this. Now in this demo, you will see the difference in the websites, but you can bring in your own custom DNS name. So it could be, tailwindtraders.com, et cetera. And the end user wouldn't know the difference in the websites. They just see Tailwind Traders. It would just then split the traffic 50-50.
In theory, you could roll out a new feature to 50% of your users, and another 50 wouldn't ever see it. Just to get
absolutely, and yeah, it will act in a round robin. So when those end users hit the website, the DNS name, the load balance within the app service plan goes right. I'm going to send 50% to production, 50% to Canary. So this is a great way to test websites and features.
It's pretty cool because we've got customers just now who are doing it like this on-prem, and they're basically just replicating the environments, and they're having to create the environments themselves. But this is so much easier and quicker to do.
It really is. I mean, we can really get this set up and running within, a matter of minutes, and being able to replicate with a deployment slot and create a deployment slot on the fly like that is so much easier to test your code. So let's go back to our pipeline. Actually, let's see what our pipeline's doing real quickly, and then we can talk through it. So we can see that it's gone through staging and it's gone through Canary. And if I click on this release that's going through, it's completed through Canary, but it hasn't gone to production. It's been queued. Would you like to take a guess why?
Manual approval needed from you guys, or? Yeah.
Absolutely. So each of these stages has another button here in the front, pre-deployment conditions. So I have set up a pre-deployment condition so that when it goes through Canary, it's deployed to Canary, but it won't go to production. So this keeps it from not going there. So I can tell it to do a certain type of trigger. So I can say after release, I can do a manual only or after stage. Now I want it to go after stage. I want it to go to Canary and then stop before it goes to production. And again, you can do things like scheduling. You can add a schedule to it and say, maybe on these days of the week, I want to put a pre-deployment condition, but maybe on the weekends we don't. We just let our code go to production. And then you can add gates as well. And gates are great to evaluate deployments. So a deployment gate will kind of just pause it. So let's say we do want to let this go through to production. We could put a deployment of minutes or even go into hours and say maybe 24 hours before it goes to production. We give our teams that kind of timing to fix anything.
Okay.
So yeah, so I have absolutely put on a pre-deployment approval. So I can select who sees, who approves it and who rejects it. I did promise you before that we can do a timeout. So if I didn't approve this, this would just time out and never deploy. And this is 30 days. I can go again, hours and minutes. So traditionally you see approvers being a group of people, not just a person. But again, if Richard and Gregor, you were both on the same team, you maybe pick someone who hasn't had touch to the code that could say, yep, this is successfully running. We could put some metrics against it. We know that it's not causing any performance issues, and we could then proceed.
I'm thinking like the person in charge of the test team might be the person to say, right, tests are all good, promote to production now.
Exactly. So that person or that team's going to be responsible for that. So that prevents it from going to production. So if I go into this Canary website, we can see it previously had $100 on it as well, and it will refresh, and we should have the $250 threshold. And there we go. So we have $250 on our Canary environment, and I have $100 still in production. So this means that if we go to either website, our front-facing website, that we should be fine and be able to see that. So actually, I have a fun little task. All right, so we now have the production website still showing $100, and we have our Canary environment showing $250. So Richard and Gregor, I want you to go to the forward-facing DNS name that I've given you guys, and I want you to tell me who has $100 and who has $250.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got 100.
And I've got 250.
Awesome, cool. So you guys are a great example of how we have 50% of the traffic going in either direction. And this is a great one to kind of do when I'll do this in front of like a pretty large audience, and usually get about 50% of the audience to raise their hand for about 100, and you get the other 50% to raise their hand for about 250. So yeah, this really shows that we can use kind of that front end load balancer that's built into the Azure web apps to leverage this kind of deployment strategy and use Azure DevOps to do continuous integration to continuous deployment of our code.
Very cool. But it's a very powerful demo, to be honest.
I really like that. That's clever. I can see us using this at work for our new releases. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've got customers using Azure who aren't making use of this, and instead they're kind of spinning up environments. So yeah, I'll need to speak to them about that. That's very cool indeed. I
think it's knowing about these extra features that are built into Azure. I mean, it's the big value add of using things like deployment slots in the web apps versus using everything on IaaS. And that's why we really encourage customers to look at, can we get your code first mentality into things like the platform as a service options? Yeah.
One quick question I've got on that is, if you spin up several deployment slots, how much more expensive is it?
So the app service plan tells you what size you're still buying compute. So let's take a step back. When you're buying platform as a service, you still have to buy compute. So if you have a website and it's working on a virtual machine on premise today, or even in Azure, it's using some kind of compute. Let's say 2 CPU and 7 gigs of RAM or 8 gigs of RAM, right? We have a web app that fits that, and that sits behind an app service plan. And that app service plan comes in tiers, kind of like t-shirt models. So kind of that middle of the road standard plan allows you up to 5 deployment slots. And then when you go up to like the premium app service plans, you get a lot more. I want to say it's 10 slots. I'd have to look at it again, but you get a lot more. So as you're kind of buying a container of capability within those app service plans.
That's cool. Yeah. So that was a really good demo, actually. I really enjoyed that.
Cool.
So I guess we should we should go with some fun questions now.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Yeah, cool. So I hear you've cycled from, or cycled to Amsterdam from London for charity. How was that? Like, I could never picture myself doing that, but yeah.
That was awesome, actually. There was about 12 of us from Microsoft in my team that did it last summer, actually. Did it about a year ago. We raised about £28,000 for Bowel Cancer UK. The person that originated the cycle ride, her mother had died from bowel cancer. So it was a personal mission for her. So that was the charity we all agreed to raise money for. So it was tough because, you know, a lot of us are remote workers at Microsoft. Even before kind of this lockdown. And so it was getting everyone together. So we did a lot of training rides together, and all of us came in with different skill sets and cycling experience. So it was really good. The ride itself was amazing. We left our Paddington office just before rush hour, which is a bit intense cycling in London. We had a few close calls with some very large buses. But it was amazing cycling past, like we put the route through like Hyde Park into past Buckingham Palace and got some amazing photos. And to see London early in the morning, sun was out, it was great. And then we went through kind of the countryside all the way up to the ferry, and then got to the ferry and had a massive steak meal. And all of us were like, you know, I'm going to have all this beer and have all this steak. And all of us were just like falling asleep because we were so tired from like the 90 miles that day. And then we spent the night on the ferry, which was interesting. I've never slept overnight on a ferry before. Arrived in Holland the next morning, and then it was flat and beautiful about 50 miles to our offices in Amsterdam. And it was awesome. We couldn't have asked for better weather. And, you know, it definitely had its, like any kind of endurance event, there's ups and downs. Like you kind of think, why did I agree to do this? And then when you get to the end, everyone's happy and smiling and celebrating. And it was an awesome achievement by everyone. It was really cool.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, hats off to you for doing that. So April, I see you've got some interesting hobbies. So you do Ironman, scuba diving and skiing. Tell us a bit more about
that. Which one? So I grew up skiing. I'm a glorified ski bum, but living in the UK is a bit tough to go skiing. So I do try to take several trips a year if I can. But yeah, I've been scuba diving for like 27 years. So I do a lot of wreck diving as well in my spare time. And then, yeah, triathlon's been my hobby for the last, 9 years. I picked that up very much accidentally, and I've fallen in love with it. And living here in the UK, I built a really good sense of community out of it. And it keeps me out of trouble when I'm not writing code.
I've got one last question, if it's all right. So, April, you speak at Ignite the Tour and Ignite and things like that. How much fun is that for you? And kind of how nervous do you get doing these kind of talks?
Wow. Ignite the Tour was amazing. We were at very different cities across the world. So I went to, unfortunately, only a few of the cities because of lockdown and COVID across the world. But the 4 cities I did get to go to was amazing. I got to meet a lot of people in Microsoft that I had heard about or, never actually met in person. For me, to be honest, it was very humbling to be up on stage, and people were very excited to come see you. I gave talks on various topics. I love going in and like getting involved in the culture. Sao Paulo was an amazing city to visit and to just be somewhere different in a very different culture. And each city had its own feel, which I loved. So that the audience was different. The types of questions you get are very different. But I think the one underlying thing is everyone was there for technology and they were always excited to learn. And I love that. I really, really love that. Did I get nervous? I was actually probably the most nervous in London. On day one, they moved the room of my talk, and they were communicating people that the rooms had been moved. And we have amazing support staff behind the scenes that were like, hey, by the way, your room has moved. And I'm like, oh, thank you. Because you get like a calendar invite that's like, right, this is your room. This is where you need to be. Don't be late. Great. Got it. And I walk up to the room, and it was the largest room in Excel, and it held like over 1,400 people. And I just kind of stood there and I was like, okay, here we go. And that was probably one of my hardest talks to give because my husband showed up at that talk and he's never seen me speak before. And I had probably at least 100 people I knew in the room. So my former manager was in the room, my previous colleagues. So I don't normally get nervous at talks because I'm excited to talk about the technology, but having people I know in the room was really difficult. I made my husband move out of the front row. I had other people I knew in the front row and they wouldn't leave despite me asking. So it's always fun for me to be on stage and to teach people something, but you know, I don't really get super nervous before on stage, but that one was probably like the one time where I sat there and I was like, all right, deep breath, here we go. So.
April, thanks for your time as always. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. Myself and Richard have learned a hell of a lot on A/B testing in Azure. It's definitely something we'll both be looking into in much more detail. So thanks for your time.
Cool. Thank you both for having me.